Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name's Thomas, back on the channel today with another kind of takeover discussion. We've done a few videos with the Esk before, but today we're joined by a man who's been on the Esk podcast, which is fantastic. Listen, they should get to. But Dave Powell from the Liverpool Echo, business writer. He's going to know far more than I am about the takeover. We're going to discuss the consortium, but not too much. We're really going to kind of focus on what's going to come. But Dave, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me on, Tom. Yeah, really appreciate the invite. It's been a crazy few weeks for Everton. Lucky enough to get invited onto the Esk podcast recently to have a chat through some things with him and Tim Keats. So yeah, it's there's plenty in play at the moment, isn't there, for Everton? So yeah, looking forward to get stuck into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not quite the summer that Everton fans were expecting. I think we were all kind of going to look at transfers that are fairly non-existent at the moment, kind of. How the management are going to develop and how Thelwell's definitely going to get on. But all of a sudden, we kind of got this takeover news. Moshiri obviously went looking for investment. The Kenyan consortium clearly decided they'd kind of try and jump on that opportunity, see if they could get a deal for the club. But we know that kind of fell through. It seemed like there was a lot of mix-up between the two parties. And, of course, the media plays a massive role in kind of negotiations, kind of putting pressure on each other. So kind of at this point, we know that it seems fairly dead in the water, but is that the kind of impression that you get?
The viewpoint from the Kaminsky group, I think, is they're still happy to be at the table and talk about it, but from the Everton side, or certainly from Moshiri's camp, it seems like that's kind of moving on now. That the exclusivity period ended a couple of weeks ago almost. There was some noises from the Kaminsky group that they wanted to extend beyond that, but that's not been the case, and that's left the floor open for Moshiri to speak to others if he so wishes. I mean, there's been various noises around whether or not he even wants to sell the football club, whether he's pivoted now and attempting to look for investment purely for the stadium and retain a controlling stake in the football club. But there won't be any shortage of interest in the club, less than there would have been maybe 18 months or so ago, because of the flirtation they had with relegation this past season, and would have shaken the confidence of a few potential investors. But otherwise, there are still people out there with deep pockets, private equity funds who've got a large amount of cash that they want to place in football somewhere that will see Everton as an opportunity. But for the moment, I think that the Kaminsky group, while they are still maintain they are actively interested in acquiring the club, there's been no further movement on the situation in the past week or so, from following on from that statement that they made, that they placed on the website last week.
Yeah, kind of, from my perspective, a fairly bizarre statement, kind of a fairly bizarre kind of going on. There was a lot of leaking to the press, which isn't necessarily the way that they claim they want to go about business, but it is what they were doing nonetheless. And as you mentioned, they're kind of, a deal's never going to take place if the seller doesn't want to sell. And I think that's been the problem with Moshiri, is it's been I didn't expect him to want to sell the club, but then kind of when the interest kind of started picking up, it seemed like it was a more logical thing to do. We know he's lost a lot of his wealth in the past year or so. We know with USM pulling out of the club, the sponsorship kind of being removed, that all of a sudden a lot of stadium funding has been lost as well. So the whole position just seemed like a bit of a mess to myself. But the Bramley-Moore doc is something I kind of want to focus on a lot more here, because we know that the Kenyan consortium, they said, the Kaminsky group, they said that they are still interested, but there was then a rumor that I think said that Moshiri was looking for maybe he was going to sell 30% of his stake for investment in the stadium, which obviously it kind of seems like it would be a fairly bizarre kind of business venture for anyone, considering the poor management of the finances of the club in the past. And I'm sure fans were looking at it, kind of looking at why would anyone invest such a vast amount of money without having a controlling say in what was going on, and kind of allowing this man who has objectively mismanaged the club for several years now. Why would they let him kind of control their money and see how that goes? But from your perspective, what is the latest on the stadium funding then? Because the kind of Usmanov leaving was a massive dent in the loss of in the funding for that anyway. And even though Moshiri went out looking for investors and this takeover kind of came out of nowhere, what do you see as the perspective from that? Is he still going to have to get investment going forward?
It needs finance. I mean, part of the deal that the Kaminsky Group had on the table was for to find the rest of the funding for Bramley-Moore Dock. But that, while they claimed the deal for the football club would have just been equity, no debt, no leverage buyouts, that they did say that refinancing would be needed to find for the rest of the stadium. So that's going to be an issue for many people who are going to come on board. I mean, they're going to have to try and find someone to come in and foot that bill. Now, obviously, we're in a difficult time economically, and there are a number of other factors which are placing strain on stadium works. Notwithstanding the crisis in Ukraine, etc., issues with Russia, they all make this a project which is far more expensive than it was initially planned to be. I know Everton have made some headway in trying to mitigate those costs by kind of getting a firm cost base from Lang O'Rourke, but moving forward, it's going to take a large amount of capital expenditure for anyone to kind of realise this or find the funding. I dare say, the reason Moshiri came in, the whole thing turned up in the first place, was that he went out looking for investment to complete the stadium. So I think he began this not really considering selling up as Everton owner, but maybe what's happened over the past few weeks has maybe changed his mind slightly. There's been as yet anyone yet to really show their hand. I know some discussions were had with some other US-based groups, but they've not really progressed too far. But it's difficult to raise that kind of financing in such a difficult climate. And also that a lot of it would depend on the projections for what's going to happen with the football team this year. Obviously, things change. The money that would be needed to, the interest rates, I dare say, would increase if the football club gets relegated, for instance, this season. So there's a lot of risk factors attached to it. And I said on the Essex podcast previously, I'd spoken to a US investor who owns a controlling stake in European football team, couple of European football teams, fairly recently when I was in the US, and we got onto talking about Everton, and he suggested that prior to their relegation fight last year, they were kind of seen as one of the teams which was kind of risk-free in terms of relegation, almost part of that group which you don't expect it to happen, and that kind of, American investors love cost certainty. They love, that's why the kind of people look towards the Americanization of sport, where there's no relegation. It's protected, it's ring fenced, but there's obviously a group of teams at the top, like the Big Six, who that is the case. And Everton were always seen as that level just beneath, where there was no real threat of relegation. But now, what happened last season may shake the confidence of some investors or some finance houses to give Everton a favourable deal when it comes to refinancing the stadium. So that's probably a challenge. I think the goalpost may have moved from 12 months ago, given the risk associated, because it's not a secret that falling out of the Premier League, or risk of falling out of the Premier League, is worth a lot. Can be catastrophic, which is why it was such a huge deal for Everton to stay up last season. But the thing, things have changed for Moshiri. I suppose raising that finance is probably more difficult now than it would have seemed, which is why he's kind of reached out to Kaminsky's. But obviously, as you mentioned before, trying to sell 30% of the business to find the remaining funding of the stadium isn't a particularly attractive option for some people. Hence the reason why I dare say that was presented to the Kaminsky Group, and they came back with a different proposition. So it's not going to be an easy task for him to raise the finance, and I expect they will find it, but I don't anticipate it'll be on the terms that Moshiri originally planned.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there that there have been kind of other groups interested, not particularly concrete interest, and it kind of hasn't gone anywhere. And we've gone from a position where I don't think anyone kind of expected Moshiri to sell kind of towards the end of the season. Now it looks like he would be open to the idea, even if it's not something he's actively searching for. But is that kind of the perspective that you see it as well? If there's a good opportunity to sell, that he will? And kind of just as a follow-up to that, can that be a concern at all if an owner is kind of open to selling and he's invested a lot of money that's been wasted, let's be honest, and since he's taken such a massive cut at his own personal value, that Is that a concern for fans that maybe investment won't be as forthcoming, even though it can't necessarily be because of profitability and sustainability? But if there's an owner looking to sell, if not actively, should that be a concern maybe going forward?
I think every football club has a price. I think every owner has a price that they're willing to exit at. I don't think. I mean, I mentioned this when I was asked the other week. I don't think I can't envisage a way that Moshiri exits Everton without taking a considerable loss. I mean, he's more than £700 million into the football club now over his tenure. But maybe he views it as, is it almost cutting your losses? So, if he does leave now, yes, he would leave with a big hole in his pocket. Or does he leave in the future when he risks losing even more money by having to fund transfer business, any further losses in the company accounts over the coming seasons, finding the whole headache around finding the financing of the stadium? Does he have to put in more to make that a reality? So there's a whole different mishmash of different bits which go on in the background that may form his thinking. It all depends what the kind of interest there is. And he's not an idiot. He'll want to get what he sees as a decent deal out of the football club. He will get more than he paid for it. I don't doubt, because football clubs aren't they don't value themselves like normal businesses. If they did, I mean, they wouldn't be worth anywhere near what the prices that are touted around at. But there's no real equity research that goes into the valuations of football clubs. It's purely a case of who paid what last time out. And then we'll go on that, base it on that figure, or you use Forbes or something like that. So they're just values which have almost plucked out of thin air, So we place a lot of weight in terms of the potential and the brand value and things. But in reality, as businesses, they're not, they're not worth that. But it's worth, I suppose, as much as someone's willing to pay for it. I think if there's a serious offer, he would consider it. But football clubs like Everton, any Premier League football club, especially ones that have a storied history, I'm not looking at your kind of Brentfords and Burnleys and Bournemouths, etc. Established football club, especially Everton, with a big fan base, a global fan base, big reach, huge city, huge demographic, historical success, that has real scarcity value for investors, especially US investors, and who are still banking on the rise of team values going forward. But that remains, attached to them being a Premier League football club. And obviously, while there is, this season or next season, you'd hope that there's going to be a considerable improvement, and that's not a concern. You can't just, brush past what happened last season and then think things will just be all right, because in the face of them losing Richarlison. So there's challenges to come, you feel. So I wonder how emboldened Moshiri will feel to sell. Maybe he rides it out until next summer. The difficulty is he will probably be thinking, do I sell a football club now as a Premier League asset with a stadium on the way that needs refinancing, but a Premier League side where the people buying it will be buying the Premier League side, and all the revenues that are attached to that, and all the cachet that you can you get from a Premier League football club, especially for US investors. I mean, the US TV market for the Premier League now is worth $2 billion over the next 6-year cycle. It's only going to increase. There's a narrative behind it with the World Cup in 2026, etc. But should he hold fire and say the unthinkable happens and Everton have a really bad season and they do go down, God forbid, that changes the landscape of things immeasurably. The value of the football club plummets. His losses become even greater than what they would have done previously. Obviously, he's banking on Everton having a season which they re-establish themselves and they get back on a more secure footing. But they're not really got the landscape at the moment to be able to achieve that, because of everything that's going on, having to manage costs with the profit and sustainability issues, etc., having to still be mindful about what they do in the transfer market, having had to sell their biggest asset prior to the end of the most recent financial year to meet those P&S obligations. So there's a lot of risk attached to this season for Moshiri, and whether or not he feels that's the kind of that's something he can shoulder, whether he feels confident enough that he can turn it around and maybe look to sell a football club on a stronger footing next summer, or whether he still sees himself here for the longer term. But It's very difficult to gauge, as I'm sure you're well aware, kind of the way the wind blows with Farhad Moshiri. So for the moment, he kind of he flirted with the idea of selling the club. Now it seems like he's kind of rown back on that a bit, but he doesn't seem quite out of the picture with it. It still seems like it's something which is definitely on the agenda for him to consider before the season begins.
Yeah, absolutely. Just touching on what you said at the end there, just the uncertainty around Moshiri. I'm sure that's kind of what the fans maybe object to the most. Obviously, poor investment is a massive one. The uncertainty around, look, the club's kind of for sale, but he would hang on. He's going to want to, as you mentioned before as well, kind of cut his losses instead of looking to kind of make a profit on all the money that he has invested in the club in the past few years. And you mentioned Richarlison there, but I want to get to him a bit later, because just before that, I want to kind of talk about the state of the board, really, because just before we were discussing about the 30% investment and how Moshiri wants to kind of keep the board the same, that we know has failed in the past few years. The board structure has been absolutely woeful. It's very clear from the fans, and I think what Moshiri's done a fantastic job at is getting fans involved in board structure. I mean, it's not something that I ever really thought about, ever really discussed, but the spotlight they've kind of shone on themselves in the past few years, especially at how poorly they have managed the club, is something seriously. There is something seriously wrong there with the club, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be much change going forwards. I think there was rumours of maybe an advisory representative, which is just seems ridiculous to me. But is that the impression you get as well, that look, if there is no sale, if there is no kind of investment, that 30%, if he doesn't get that, is the board just going to remain completely the same despite all the fan protests that have gone
on? I don't see how. I don't see sweeping change unless he leaves. Really, I think it's quite established there. I mean, Moshiri has absolute control, doesn't he? In the end, it's he's been heavily involved with everything, right down to kind of player recruitment and the agents you use and stuff. So it's I don't see a great deal of change unless he moves on. I think the status quo will remain. And even if you change a couple of bodies around, ultimately it will still be Moshiri who retains ultimate control, and you'd be requiring on him to have a change of tact in the way he approaches his running of the football club. And it's important to stress that while the investment has been bad, he was a willing investor in trying to achieve something to his credit. He spent a lot of money on players. He moved on the Bramley-Moore Dock development to be something which is actually, looks like it's going to be realised. And ultimately, the only way, moving forward, that Everton will be able to grow their revenue streams and compete is by the realisation of a new stadium, because Goodison Park ultimately hamstrings and makes them hamstring a little bit because of you're limited on the amount of commercial revenue you can gain from it. But I don't see much changing unless Moshiri leaves. You may get some. I don't want to use the phrase deck chairs on a Titanic because it's not appropriate for this. But I was going to use that analogy, but it's not appropriate. It's a case of just I don't think much will change by changing a couple of people on the board. You can get in. I mean, Marcel Brands arrived with a fine reputation and was supposed to drive the structure forward. But again, I mean, you only have to see the comments he made in kind of Dutch media recently, kind of trying to absolve himself of any blame on that respect and deflecting it back to Moshiri. So I do feel that the status quo will kind of remain unless we have a change of board, because ultimately it's he who controls that will have the final say. So yeah, I don't anticipate much change unless it's a full sale. And even then, if you do make change, it has to be meaningful change. It's can't just be giving seats on the board to former players because you feel it appeals to the fans. I mean, fans see through that now. They need real expertise to try and change the dynamic of the football club and move it forward and ensure them, because they're not keeping pace with the rest of the Premier League, and that's the reality. They're managing a situation. And while they're managing it admirably, I suppose, at the moment, they're doing what they have to do. All the while, they are losing ground on everyone else. They're losing, they're losing ground on teams that have come up with the likes of Brentford and stuff. I mean, they're already ahead in terms of their recruitment strategy, the way they identify players. They've got a new stadium, etc. So all these are concerns which didn't exist when Moshiri took the club on, so, but now the chasm is growing between them, and not only, the big six, which was what, when Moshiri came in, that was a big thing, wasn't it? Spend a lot of money, bridge the gap between the big six, but we quickly found unless you have the revenue stream to back that up, you can't do it, which is why they've got the issues they have at the moment. There's going to be a growing gap between Everton and the kind of middle of the road Premier League teams, and that's when it gets concerning. So I don't have any answers in terms of how he turns this around. Really, it's he'll be a more intelligent man than I, with wealth far beyond my own. So I'd assume he has more ideas about where he gets the answers from. But it seems like, once they've managed this situation, it appears that fresh eyes are needed somewhere, whether that's a full takeover, or he cedes some control of the football club to someone who can come in with some fresh eyes and shake things up.
Yeah, extremely encouraging words there. That nothing is going to change going forward necessarily on the board, and we will have to see how it develops. But something that has changed, of course, since Moshiri took over is how much he can reinvest in the squad. Kind of selling Lukaku, we saw that money immediately reinvested in that summer of signing about 10 number 10s. Of course, you look at Leeds this year, selling Calvin Phillips and Rafinha, massive fees that they're going to be able to reinvest that. And you mentioned before selling Richarlison, it was just before the end of the financial year, which, as you mentioned, did appease profitability and sustainability to an extent, in a way that kind of shone us in a slightly better light than we were before. But maybe some fans have seen selling Richarlison as, we can reinvest that. Sounds like about £60 million or something. We can see that invested. Where is that being invested? And from what I understand, that's not necessarily the case. That was more of a balance in the books than kind of a selling a big player to reinvest. So what do you see as kind of the projection for the summer now of investment?
There will be, there'll be an element of it has a knock-on effect in terms of Everton being able to get some deals done, but that'll largely be through the cost savings that it achieves through. So you remove Richarlison's amortization figures, for example, from when he joined at Watford, because obviously that amortization, your transfer fee shows in the accounts as the number of years in the contract divided by or the transfer fee divided by the number of years of the player contract. And Richarlison was signed in 2018, was it? I think for a fee, it was up to 50 million, but guaranteed, I think it was about 40, wasn't it? So there's a saving there. His wages, obviously, but I mean, play wages have gone up since then anyway. So you're only going to be that's a minimal saving to be had there. But what it does do, it allows them some wriggle room in terms of this coming transfer window, or this coming accounting period, because they haven't got to worry about, because they managed to appease some of the or ease some of the damage which had been done for the last financial period. So this one, they have a little bit more breathing space, which means that they will be able to bring some players. It's not going to be like for like. They're not going to go out and spend 30, 40 million. But you've seen the kind of players that they've been linked with. I think that moves like Conor Gallagher and stuff like that makes a lot of sense. I think this season will be about managing things effectively moving forward, so that next season, so 23-24, they approach it in almost like a clean slate. So you've managed the P&S issues, and the club is hopefully marching towards something like a profitable business. That hasn't been the case in recent years. Cumulative losses of £300 million is pretty drastic. So there's a lot of work to be done to get themselves back to that position, but they have to keep a nucleus of a squad which is capable of competing in the Premier League. So you almost have to reinvest in a certain amount of money in order to make sure that you don't fall out of the Premier League and lose even more money. So it's kind of risk and reward. So I expect there will be some money made available. I mean, you saw in January, Lucas Digne went out, in came Kalenko and Nathan Patterson. So it won't be like for like in terms of the money spent to replace Richarlison, but there will be some money to add to the squad somewhere, whether that's through paying a good wage to someone on a free transfer or on a loan, or whether that's through trying to find some undervalued talent. I mean, we've seen Keane Lewis Potter move today, players like that, So, but it's going to be a season of managing the financial issues they have and ensuring that by the time 2023-24 starts, they have almost a clean slate where they can kind of push on and try and claw back some of the ground that they have lost over the past few years.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like, well, last summer was definitely a precarious position, spending only £1.5 million. This year seems pretty much the same. It seems like the director of football, though, is making kind of changes across the club to try and save money or make better on the investment. So we'll have to see how that develops. But that does pretty much bring me to the end of my questions, Dave. Thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate it. If our viewers want to find any more of your work, where can they find you?
I'm on Everton Liverpool for the Echo, so it's obviously you guys will be interested in the Blue Half of Merseyside. So it's Liverpool Echo / Everton FC, or it's me on Twitter. It's @_Dave Powell.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful in kind of trying to understand what the situation is at the moment, kind of aside from all the Twitter rumours and whatever might come out randomly in the media. But thank you all very much for watching, and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.